where I tell stories of the mysterious, twisted, and paranormal. And today is no different. I got a really good story for you guys. So, without any further ado, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. On December 29th, 1972, N310EA was scheduled for a flight from New York to Miami International Airport. Captain Robert Loft was the pilot, and he was very experienced and had a crew altogether of 13, and altogether there were 176 souls on board. Now, the plane they were flying was a Lockheed L1011 TriStar, and it was one of the most technologically advanced aircraft up to that point, including having the ability to go on autopilot. Now, the captain discovered a problem when the landing gear was lowered, and he noticed that some of the wheel indicator lights had not come on. And Captain Loft was convinced that this was just a problem with an indicator light rather than it being the whole landing gear itself. So he told his first officer, Alfred Stockstill, to replace the bulb, and while he was doing that, flight engineer Donald Repo climbed into the avionics bay, also called the hellhole, which was below the flight deck, and from there he could do a visual inspection of the landing gear just to make sure that it actually was down. This is when the pilots radioed into the tower, and the tower told them to set their course at an altitude of 2,000 feet in the air, west of Miami, which is over the Everglades. And then they were told to remain there, to wait as they diagnosed their problem. Now, during this and all the confusion, Captain Loft turned around to speak to other crew members when he accidentally, without knowing, nudged the control wheel with just enough force to disengage autopilot. So just imagine now, the plane was beginning a very slow, unintentional descent over the Everglades, which was west of Miami and basically nothing but 1.5 million acres of wetland and swamps. Now, when the autopilot is disengaged and the altitude drops below 250 feet of where it was at, an indicator light comes on. So since the plane was at 2,000 feet, that would mean a light or alert would be going off at about 1,750 feet. But they did not hear this because of the distraction of the landing gear light. And because of that, it was never heard. And investigators even later stated that they could actually hear the alert on the cockpit voice recorder. And you got to remember, this was at nighttime, so there was no foreseeable horizon. And you got to remember, autopilot at this time was extremely new. And some of the investigators think that the pilots put maybe too much confidence in this device. Now, what this means is that the pilots diverted their attention away from their flying instruments to try and handle their landing gear problem and talk to the crew. And their mind, they're still flying at 2,000 feet and nothing other than landing gear at this moment's going wrong. I mean, that's what's going through their heads. But in reality, they are slowly descending and not feeling it because it is a slight descent in the dark. And the reason why air traffic control did not realize the descent of the aircraft as well is because there was another plane in distress in that area that was having some problems at the exact same time. And at that moment, air traffic control was working on fixing the problem with the other plane. And then by the time that air traffic control radioed them, it wasn't to let them know about their descent. It was to tell them that they could turn around and come back to the airport. And that's when the pilot's attention was back on their instruments. And they noticed that their altitude, instead of being at 2,000 feet, was just merely feet above the ground. It was too late. And Flight 401 crashed into the Everglades at an incredible speed of 227 miles per hour. And as they crashed, a fire blew throughout the cabins, and the plane slammed into the Florida Everglades just west of Miami. And out of the 176 souls on board, 101 of them died on impact or very soon after. But remember, this is only the tip of the iceberg in this story. It becomes way more creepy, you could say. And after the crash, those that remained alive were just clinging onto debris in this alligator-infested swamp, just waiting to be rescued. And First Officer Stockstill was the first one to die out of the officers, and then Captain Loft succumbed to his injuries as well before even help arrived. And then Flight Engineer Repo was still alive when rescue crews got there, but he died later on in the hospital. But Captain Loft was right in the end, because when the investigation started, it revealed that the landing gear actually did engage and was locked in position. And all that was wrong was a faulty bulb. This was a serious tragedy. But the story continues, more so about the people that were on the plane. And what I mean by that is that N310EA was damaged beyond repair and would definitely never hit the skies again. But since they landed on a swampy ground, it kind of cushioned the plane when it crashed, which means that the whole plane actually wasn't destroyed entirely. In fact, amongst the things that were left salvageable was parts of the galley, and Lockheed engineers determined that these parts could be fitted to new TriStars that were coming off the production line. And one of these was N318EA, and it ended up in the Eastern Airline fleet as well, as a replacement for the doomed Flight 401. And it was even given the same route, which was New York to Miami. Now this is when the stories begin, because in 1973, a senior executive for Eastern Airlines was on a flight that was going once again from JFK in New York to Miami International Airport in Florida, and he enjoyed certain privileges because of his position. So on an empty airplane, he was making his way to the first class cabins when he spotted a man in full captain uniform. So the senior executive walked over, introduced himself, and the two got to talking. And as they were talking, he looked at the captain's name tag, and literally the hairs on the back of his neck stood. And all of a sudden, that name tag in his head, he noticed, said Loft. And the next moment, the captain he'd been talking to literally vanished into thin air right in front of his eyes. Now, this executive, who was also the vice president of Eastern Airlines, ran from the plane and alerted an airline employee immediately. And he took the story to mean that there was possibly a stowaway on board. So they organized a search, and after they did the search, no trace of this quote-unquote captain was found. Now, if this would have been the only sighting of Captain Loft who died after crashing in Flight 401, then it could have been put to rest as some, hallucination or something else. But however, Loft would appear again, and this time to a whole group of people. You see, a few months later, after that incident, several crew members were boarding the same aircraft at JFK when they encountered the captain. And they did not recognize him, so they started up a conversation, and as they were talking to him, he disappeared almost like a holographic image or a ghost. And this experience, you could say, traumatized the crew so much that they ended up canceling the flights that day. Not to mention that Captain Loft was not the only member of Flight 401's doomed crew that would appear to different people, especially the staff on Eastern Airlines. For example, aboard another flight, the engineer was on there doing his pre-flight checks and, making sure everything's good before they take off, and he found a uniformed officer already sitting in his seat. But the terrifying thing was that the engineer recognized the man, and it was none other than Don Repo. And at this moment, Repo spoke, and he said, "No need to worry about the pre-flights today. I've already done it. And then just like that, Repo disappeared. And not to mention, on a separate flight, the captain that was flying that plane swore that he saw a clear image of Repo's face. And Repo told him that there will never be a crash on an L1011 again. We won't let it happen, he said. Now imagine the goosebumps the captain got the second that this happened. And at this point, the rumors of these ghost stories and sightings and apparitions spread like wildfire amongst Eastern employees. And in fact, the ghost stories became so prevalent that the management there were actually forced to issue a directive that warned staff that they faced being fired if they were found to be spreading any unfounded rumors. Now, of course management would say this. I mean, nobody wants to fly on a passenger airliner if the whole fleet is haunted of crash victims and ghosts from the Everglades. I mean, I might want to fly on it, but not a lot of people. So even though the directive stopped rumors in the rumor mill from occurring, it did not stop something else, which was the ghostly sightings. Now, the flight crew aboard another flight going to Miami, cruising at an altitude of about 39,000 feet, were relaxing when all of a sudden they heard a knock, and the knock was coming from the quote-unquote hellhole. So this is when the flight engineer, he opened up the hatch, took his flashlight to check, if anybody was down there. And when he was looking down there, that's when all of a sudden he saw the disembodied face of Don Repo. And it should be noted that this is exactly where the engineer had been when Flight 401 hit the Everglades. But I say this because it's important. It was not just the flight crew that saw these apparitions. I mean, on a different occasion, the catering staff were loading supplies onto the plane when suddenly they ran from the aircraft in a very panicked state and kept emphatically refusing to go back on board. And when asked what happened, they were like running, and all the caterers just said that they saw a flight engineer standing in the forward galley and that the man vanished once again right in front of their eyes. And this literally spooked them half to death. Also, there were actual passengers who encountered these ghostly figures as well. There was this one woman on a flight who alerted the flight attendant to report that a man sitting beside her in full uniform appeared to be very sick. So after trying to get help, she turned back and she found that all of a sudden the man was gone. But there's more. Another passenger had a very similar experience and got hysterical when the apparition just disappeared once again right in front of her eyes. And both of these women were later shown photographs, and they identified the man as none other than Don Repo. I mean, one person guessing at a bunch of pictures is one thing, but I mean, two people, the odds start to increase more and more, especially once it's been pilots and flight attendants, the crew, the engineers, the caterers, the passengers. So many different people saw these apparitions or ghosts. Plus, at this point, the sightings would continue for Eastern Airlines, and the company would try to keep the stories under wraps, but that was seeming to be impossible because at the time the airline was inundated with calls from paranormal investigators and psychics who just wanted to go on board of the plane and do a reading. But of course, these requests were always denied. And the airline also had to contend with the mere fact that many of its staffers absolutely swore by their stories. And these individuals could not be so easily discounted, seeing as that they were their employees, their pilots, their flight engineers, and of course, their vice president. And at this time, the Flight Safety Foundation was also made aware of these stories, and they did not dismiss them right away either. In fact, the foundation took the extraordinary step of issuing a statement saying the reports were given by experienced and trustworthy pilots and crew, and we consider them significant. Now, this goes back to something I said earlier when Repo said we won't let the plane crash again or let anything happen to it. Because, there was an incredible incident where These ghosts intervened to save lives, and this occurred on Flight 903 out of JFK, headed to Mexico City this time. So there was a flight attendant named Meriwether, and she was in the galley preparing the meals for all the passengers, and all of a sudden she reached for the handle of the oven, and she was startled because she saw the face of Don Repo staring back at her from the glass. But Meriwether was, familiar with all the ghost stories going on, plus she was not one to panic easily, so she calmly went to fetch the flight engineer. Also, another flight attendant accompanied them back to the galley as well, and all three of them saw Don Repo's face this time, and the apparition actually spoke to them and specifically said, "Watch out for fire on this plane." Now, this warning was actually took serious and was relayed to the captain, who double-checked all the gauges and, confirmed that nothing was amiss. And when the plane landed safely in Mexico City, it seemed that, the warning maybe was incorrect. But at this point, the engines were inspected during the turnaround and also found to be in perfect working order. But it was on the return flight that problems started to emerge, and the plane was still in its ascent when the starboard engine backfired several times and then failed, and then it was shut down before it caught fire, and the plane then returned safely to the airport, and literally a true tragedy had been averted. So by now, the ghost stories surrounding the plane and other planes that received parts from the crashed 401 were beginning to spook all the flight crews, and many of them refused to fly on them again. So eventually, Eastern Airlines caved in and had the plane retrofitted with new parts. And mysteriously enough, right after they did that, the ghost of Captain Loft and Don Repo were never seen again. And eventually, Eastern Airlines itself would become extinct as the company ran into financial problems in the 80s and totally ceased operations in 1991. A lot of people have absolutely no idea what to make of this story, because there is a natural human instinct to reject the idea of paranormal phenomenon and to look for a more rational explanation. But on the other hand, there are multiple first-hand accounts from extremely credible witnesses. And remember that all of them swore to have seen ghosts of these dead aviators. So one thing is for certain: Don Repo's promise to protect Eastern's remaining fleet was fulfilled. Because after the tragedy of Flight 401, the TriStars would hold an incredibly high safety record. So do you believe in ghosts? Let me know if you do in the comments right now. Let me know what you think of ghosts and if you think this story is real. I mean, with this many witnesses, it's hard to just push it aside. Make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss an incredible story. And if you still want to slip into the mind of someone that's not your own, make sure to click on one of these stories right here, right now on the screen, and learn more and more about the world that is unseen or unheard.